Hey there, Dr. Mark here. The fitness and health industry was turned upside down when intermittent fasting came onto the scene in the last 10 years. You see, you have to remember, not eating for long periods of time was essentially the exact opposite of what everyone had been taught and what everyone believed. And this trend has hung around and it stood the test of time, which is why today I'm explaining the top 10 things you need to know about intermittent fasting. We're going to be talking strengths and weaknesses of fasting, who should be doing it and who should be avoiding it at all costs. Here are the 10 things you need to know, starting with number 1, autophagy. Every time I bring up fasting, people are curious to know the impact it has on something called autophagy, because most proponents of intermittent fasting highlight this as the key benefit. Autophagy is the natural process your body undergoes to remove damage or dysfunctional parts of the cell. This is the body's way of replacing older cells with new, healthier cells. Think of it like spring cleaning. And in animal studies, intermittent fasting has been shown to induce this process. But here's the deal. It's very hard to say based on the evidence right now if this has a meaningful impact on your health or if it's superior to just overnight fasting or the space between meals. Plus, autophagy can also be induced by exercise or infection or different types of stress. So we don't know at this moment if it's superior or even necessary for optimal health. Now, that's not to say there aren't benefits to intermittent fasting, but we should probably talk about the different types of fasting first. Although intermittent fasting is the umbrella term, not all fasting is going to be the same. There's going to be different types. They'll usually differ in their cycles of fasting and feeding, meaning the time between when you eat and when you don't eat, and exactly what you're avoiding. Are you avoiding everything but liquids or all nutrient compounds entirely? One thing I will say right off the bat is that it is not advisable to do a dry fast where you abstain from all fluids entirely. We have case report studies where people will not eat for an entire year if they're morbidly obese, but you can't do that with liquids, not even for 3 or 4 days. This will lead to extreme dehydration and negative health consequences and sometimes even death. Now, some of the most popular fasting approaches include 16-8 or the lean gains method, which includes a 16-hour fast and then eating for an 8-hour window, usually with the eating coming in the hours before sleeping, but not always. And you're doing this process essentially every day, which is different to something like alternate day fasting, where there's complete or partial fasting on one day and then normal eating on the other. If you're interested in learning more about these approaches and their effectiveness on weight loss, when compared to traditional calorie restriction, you're gonna want to check out this paper. Spoiler alert, alternate day fasting, which I personally have never tried, does appear to be the most promising. Now, quick note about fasting in general. I don't want this video to come off like I'm against fasting, because I'm not. I've personally used fasting to great success. It changed a lot for me physically, but it also changed a lot of my views around meal timing and breakfast. But there are some downsides that need to be highlighted. One thing you want to keep in mind is that anything that alters your eating habits, especially when it comes to appetite and hunger and energy levels, there's going to be an adjustment period. You just can't eat within 30 minutes of waking up for 30 years and assume you're not going to be hungry in the morning, because you will. This doesn't mean fasting is bad or that it isn't for you per se, but there is an adjustment period. Here's what fasting isn't though, and I'm going to be clear about this. It isn't a magical fat loss solution. For whatever reason, there's a large group of fasting enthusiasts who think that if they abstain from food for a period of time, they're above the laws of thermodynamics, which in this case is the assumption that weight loss and weight gain are caused by a surplus or a deficit in energy. And unfortunately, this group doesn't really believe that. And it's because they bought into the myth that this is all hormonally driven. The myth goes as follows. Fat gain is caused by hormones, mainly insulin secreted when you eat carbohydrates. Since insulin is the storage hormone, it is the key that unlocks the fat loss puzzle. So if you avoid food, and namely carbohydrates, in a prolonged fasting period, there's going to be no increase in hormones and no fat gain. But it's not as simple as that. And that's because changes in fat tissue are still an energy balance issue, independent of hormones. And it doesn't matter if you don't eat anything for an entire day. If you overconsume in the next, to the point that that negative energy balance is erased, you're going to gain fat and you're going to gain weight. It's still a checks and balance game. With that being said, many people, including myself, still find fasting to be an effective way to manage and control calories. One thing that I absolutely love about fasting as a nutrition coach from a practical perspective is that it suits some people more than others, specifically when it comes to larger and smaller meals. As you know, there is no one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to health and wellness. No specific strategy that's gonna work for everyone in the same way, but there are some underlying principles that do tell us why things work. For example, meal frequency. If you split up the same amount of calories between different meals, let's say you have 2,000 calories to work with, and you compare one day that has you eating one meal at 2,000 calories and another day that has that split up between 5 meals at 400 calories each, it will have similar impacts on your metabolism and your body composition over longer periods of time. There's no real difference, which means for people who really enjoy eating larger meals, they feel better eating not so frequently and they find it easier to stick to. They can fast for longer periods of time and do really well. So if you or a client find that you feel better eating not so frequently and you find it easier to stick to, which is the thing that matters the most anyway, then intermittent fasting might be the right move for you. In my view, coaching is all about finding the strategies that remove resistance to sticking to a plan and nailing the thing that matters the most. It's not about finding the thing that is quote unquote right. It's all about applying what will work. And for some people, larger, bigger, less frequent meals are going to be the ticket. With that being said, really limiting your eating window might have some practical limitations, so let's talk about that. If you're someone that's looking to get leaner, gain some muscle and some strength, the key isn't always less calories, less carbohydrates, limiting or avoiding this or that. You want to be eating as much as you can, as much quality nutrients and calories while still making progress. And this can be really tough to do if you have a limited period of time that you can do it in, especially when it comes to things like protein. Protein is a macronutrient that is very satiating, it keeps you full. So if you have to eat 200 grams of protein per day to see results, your eating window might need to be at least 8 hours to get all of that in successfully. And if you find yourself in a situation where you're constantly stressing about how you're gonna work all of that in, it can become problematic if you don't have a strong appetite or can't plan well. Think about it this way. Let's say you have a big test in an important course or subject on Thursday, and you think, I have plenty of time. I'm gonna cram it all in on Wednesday night. If we're being practical here, you're probably not gonna start when you think you are, and chances are you won't leave yourself enough time realistically to get adequately prepared. Your food levels are the same way. Chances are you need more time to eat enough and prepare enough of the right things, so you need to be mindful of this. Not saying you can't pull it off, but you might need some extra time and preparation to get things right. And here's one group of people that regularly fast that have to figure it out. Let's talk about them, athletes in Ramadan. For the most part, people have a choice before they try intermittent fasting, but there are some groups of people that must fast for religious reasons. One fascinating case study from this perspective is athletes in Ramadan. In Ramadan, Muslims fast for 30 days between sunrise and sunset, which automatically restricts their eating window, which can be tough for anyone in general, but specifically tough for competitive athletes. But these athletes have found ways to manage through it, and peer-reviewed scientific research, although mixed, has shown for the most part it has no negative impact on performance. Here's what they do though to nail their nutrition in a time-restricted fashion. They place training and exercise around their meal window. They eat sufficient protein, carbohydrates, and total calories during the feeding window. They emphasize convenient and easily digestible food sources to accommodate higher levels of calories in shorter time frames, and they make sure their sleep and recovery are properly controlled, which sounds a lot like the situation most people find themselves in when they are fasting, which means your performance doesn't necessarily need to drop with the proper planning. Now, if you do have a choice, you might want to contemplate your relationship with food before you try intermittent fasting. If you've had any previous issues with dysfunctional eating, be it disordered eating, where there's too much of an emphasis on eating healthy, or eating a certain way and it leads to negative behavior, or a legitimate eating disorder diagnosis, you may need to consider if intermittent fasting is right for you. Since there could be a tendency to view eating outside of the eating window as bad or wrong, intermittent fasting has the potential to trigger some past food patterns that can impact someone's relationship with food. Something to consider for sure, but if you have no previous issues or concerns, I do think intermittent fasting is something you should consider trying. There's tons of merit to having some routine and structure when it comes to eating, but also having some flexibility and not being tied to the clock, needing to eat every 3 hours. Intermittent fasting can be helpful to break you out of that. One thing intermittent fasting isn't though is number 8. It isn't a free-for-all. Just because you're eating in a time-restricted fashion doesn't mean you get a hall pass to eat absolutely whatever you want. It's not an automatic green light. When you eat in a time-restricted fashion, you do build up that calorie buffer, where some conventional high-calorie choices aren't going to impact you as much. You're going to have a bigger calorie budget to play around with, but that doesn't mean you can eat whatever you want or that macros don't matter, because this will catch up to you. And just like you can gain excess body fat eating healthy, healthy. It's totally possible to fast most of the day and erase any progress you would have made by choosing the wrong foods when you are eating. Intermittent fasting is not a license to eat whatever you want. You still want to pick nutrient-dense foods that you eat within your eating window, because in most cases, this is going to help you hit your requirements and also improve your overall health. Sure, you will have more wiggle room to work in more treat-based, higher calorie foods and get away with it, but don't abuse it. With that being said, if you're trying to gain muscle, intermittent fasting may not be the best approach, and here's why. If you're trying to gain muscle, the emphasis of your nutrition is going to need to be on eating enough, which can be hard to do if you're restricting the amount of time that you can eat it in, or if you struggle to eat enough to begin with. I know this may seem like common sense, but it's very easy to fall into this trap, thinking that intermittent fasting is the best way to do everything, when in reality, it has pros and cons like anything else, and should be viewed as a helpful tool in some situations. And in my opinion, gaining muscle is not one of those situations. And it's purely for practical reasons. Can you gain muscle while fasting? Of course. Do enough training, eat enough calories and sufficient protein, and you will gain muscle. But a limited time window is gonna make it tougher to work this all in. I'm not sure why you would take something that's already difficult to do and make it harder on yourself. I don't know, unless you're a glutton for punishment. The last thing I wanna highlight here is number 10, the impact that fasting has on female sex hormones. We've talked a lot today about how intermittent fasting has an impact on your energy intake, simply because you're eating for less time, which is the point in most cases. But sufficient energy intake, even while in a calorie deficit, needs to be a priority for everyone, but specifically for females. And that's because low energy diets will impact females more severely, both from a stress and reproductive standpoint. I'd be wary of fasting if you're trying to conceive or improve your reproductive health, and especially if you're pregnant or breastfeeding. But even when this isn't a priority, like in post-menopause, intermittent fasting can still be an additional stressor on top of controlling for calories that may not be helpful. Could it work? Sure, but proceed with caution. And that's it, folks. 10 things you need to know about intermittent fasting, and here's my overall take. No one needs to be doing intermittent fasting for prolonged periods of time. It's not gonna magically heal you. But if you'd like to lose some weight and you need to stick to a calorie deficit, and you don't feel hungry first thing in the morning, and you enjoy eating larger, more filling meals, then increasing your fasting window and strategically delaying breakfast through intermittent fasting might be helpful for you. Again, there's no magic, but it may be a helpful tool for many. Now, as great as all those tips are, if you're really serious about starting a nutrition coaching business, the next thing I'm gonna have you do is check out this video I've linked up right here. Today, we talked all about intermittent fasting. Now we're gonna look at other popular diets, ranking them from good to terrible. So make sure to check it out now, and I'll see you in the next video.